comment, bienvenue, welcome once again to another live stream. I'm overjoyed that in the studio I have Stephanie Mitchel Hughes. Stephanie has been through a number of hard places through a process that she refers to as Resilience 2.0, a rebirth, if you will. And now we often discuss things of importance, particularly to the Black origin story, to the Black existence, what it means to be Black in modern America, but also with reference also to the legal profession from which Stephanie has spent a long time. Now, we don't normally do this. We've reviewed music before now. We've reviewed other people's writing. Today, we're reviewing a book that she's brought to my attention, The Barn, The Secret History of a Murder in Mississippi, which is a shocking and revelationary account of the murder of Emmett Till. And apparently it's been said that it really lays bare how forces around the world converged on the Mississippi Delta in the long lead up to the actual event itself, how the truth was held back for so long. And it all features around Wright Thompson's family farm in Mississippi, which is 23 miles from the actual site of this most notorious and consequential killing potentially in the whole of American history. Welcome, Stephanie. I'm sorry about the long lead up.
No, it's okay, because yes, so I'll tell for people who don't know.
Yeah.
So in 1955, there was a young Black man, really a child. He would be considered a teenager.
Right.
He was 14 years old at the time, and he was the only child of Mamie Till. And I don't remember her husband's first and Emmett's father's first name, but his father was not present. I think he was deceased. He died. His father had been in the military, and he actually was court-martialed for another crime, and that's a separate matter entirely, but that's discussed in the book. So Emmett's mother was originally from Mississippi, down in what we would call the Delta.
Right.
And she was born in the 1920s. And so this incident with Emmett Till's lynching, which is what it was, and was one of the catalysts that started the modern civil rights movement in this country. And so there were, and this has to do with the migration, and to learn more about the great migration of Black people from the South to the North, I would strongly encourage you to read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. But what happened was, down in the area where Mamie Till grew up, Mamie Till, her family, her siblings, many, many Black people grew up, there was a code of understanding that you did not look white people in the face. If you were walking down the sidewalk and a white person was walking down the sidewalk coming from the other direction, you had to literally get down in the ditch, and let them have the whole sidewalk. But there was a code. There was an unwritten code that Black people followed in the South, particularly to avoid being lynched.
And what happened here wasn't simply a lynching, though.
No, it was just an outright.
Well, this book, no, this was a torture before Howard Strait, before his untimely death. This is far more, and it involves money. It involves property. It involves hiding in plain sight, and it also involves the absolutely horrendous fact that the perpetrators were acquitted initially.
Yeah, well, and see, okay, so, and I just wanted to give people a little bit of context. So what happened was when Mamie Till, as she became of age, there were a number of lynchings that were happening in increasing numbers across the South and particularly in the Mississippi Delta. And so there was one in particular that caused a number of the family members to pack up and head north. And they settled, like many people from Mississippi, they settled in Chicago. So Emmett is 14. He is, wanting to be a teenager, wanting to have more responsibility, wanting to be more independent. And he had been bugging his mother to go down to the Delta to spend time with her family, with his family, spend some weeks in the summer with his family. And so his mother, Mamie Till, finally says, okay, yeah, you can go. And he goes down. And before he leaves, his mother gives him and tells him the rules of the road. And she's drilling this into him because she's like, I'm afraid to let my child go because he may be killed while he's down there. Because things are not as, you don't have so much of this. It's not that racism didn't exist in Chicago, but Black people had a very different life in places like Chicago, and what have you, than they did in the Delta. So anyway, he gets down there and with assurances of family members, etc., I'm going to be okay. And the family members are like, well, watch out for him. And there was a rule, don't go to this particular store. Well, as kids are wont to do, Emmett and some of his cousins all went to the store. And this store was owned by Roy and Carolyn Bryant. And so allegedly, reportedly, Emmett whistled at Mrs. Bryant, after others had left the store. So she tells her husband, one of the individuals who was tried and then subsequently acquitted by a jury of all men and all white men, and the rest, in a way, because of what happened to Emmett and because of who Mamie Till was. There are so many stories like Emmett. There are so many Emmett Tills that are down, buried somewhere in the South.
What was different? What was fundamental?
And everything. But the thing that made this particular incident different, was number one, the family began to indirectly put some pressure on other Black families and the community to find Emmett's body. Well, they wanted to find him, and when it didn't look like that he was going to be found alive, they wanted to find his body. And so they did subsequently find his body. And his mother said at first the coroner down in Mississippi was not going to release the body because of its condition. He had been submerged in the river. He had been, I believe he had been subject to beatings and all manner of things, including with a cotton gin. And so with the promise with the cotton gin, that is so notorious and was extremely popular in the Delta, that was an invention that was used to process cotton, which was at the time and for many, many years, particularly in the latter part of the 1800s and into the 1900s, well into the 1900s, well into the 1960s, and possibly even beyond. One of the big things that happened with Black people in Mississippi was that they lived on land where their ancestors had been enslaved as sharecroppers. And the crop, one of the big crops that they picked was cotton.
Right.
And so the cotton gin was an invention that was designed to make the processing, the picking of cotton and everything associated with it that much quicker.
But
And I guess
it's a machine of some sort.
Yeah, it was a machine. So there was a promise made, and this is discussed in the book, that they would not, Mamie Till would not show Emmett Till's body at a funeral. So they wouldn't have a viewing where people could come up and view his body. And they made a promise with, I guess, their fingers crossed behind them. And Mamie Till, when the body got back to Chicago, Mamie Till basically said, well, I don't know exactly what she said, but she said something to the effect of, okay, no, I am going to show the world what these people did to my child. And so the undertaker, the funeral director, put Emmett's body in a casket, and they put glass over the top of it. And because in 1955, unlike in the early part of the 1900s, we had Black newspapers, because we had some Black magazines, etc. We had Black photographers and journalists. Emmett's picture was taken and it exploded across this country and possibly and probably around the world. And so if you I don't know if you can find, there are pictures out there on the internet that show the condition of Emmett Till's body. Right. And there are pictures of him and his mother, Mamie Till, and what have you. But what Wright Thompson does in The Barn with his book, The Barn, is he traces the history of the barn, how this particular building came to be, by going all the way back to when Indians and tribes lived on and held that land, how they were pushed off of that land when you began to have white settlers coming to America from your neck of the woods, and they pushed them off of that land so that they could have it and use it. And so he traces the history of different families that are in the area. He talks about the history of his own family and his interactions with his family's interactions with some of these families. He talks about Nathan Forrest. I think it's Nathan Forrest, the person who was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. And he was in the Civil War, fought in the Civil War. And so what he does is he goes back and he traces how this particular building came to be by looking all the way back historically to talk about how indigenous people were pushed off that land, how the land itself came to be cleared, whose lives were really valued in doing this part, in developing that land. Talks about slavery and the impact and how the land came to be occupied and that barn came to be occupied. He opens the book with Emmett Till's story, but he also, in the course of telling that story, talks about some people who were less well known in Emmett Till's story. There was a man who happened to be, he was a young man, teenager. He happened to be walking to the store during the time and at the time that Emmett was being murdered in the barn. He was walking to the store, and he is walking past the part where the barn is located, and he could hear it. A person later identified as Emmett Till crying out for his mother as he was beaten and basically abused, and all kinds of the horrific things that happened to him. And ultimately, in terms of, and for people who don't know Emmett Till's story and how he was subsequently found, Roy Bryant got a gang of his friends together, and they went out to figured out where Emmett was staying, what family he was staying with, etc., and went out and found him.
Well, it was Roy and his half brother J.W. Millam. They did it for money.
They went out there. Yeah, they went out there
They were paid $4,000, which is
allegedly, reportedly, they went out there to find Emmett.
Yeah,
and they basically, and this is something that could happen and did happen in Black communities, because the Black people at that time when Emmett was down there, they lived far out, so that if somebody, it's like an out of sight, out of mind type of a thing. But they knew where he was, who he was visiting, where he was staying, and they came out to the house in the middle of the night. And even though they begged him, the adults who were there begged them not to take him. They went through the house, because white people could just walk in to your house without knocking on the door and being asking if they can come in. They just walked in the house, flashlights, and looked all over the house, and they found Emmett. And there's some question as to where Carolyn Bryant was when they were looking for him, but wherever she was, they took Emmett, and she identified him. Now, very recently, it has come out, and most people suspected this to be true in the first place, that Emmett did not do exactly what Carolyn Bryant accused him of. Because one of the things that Wright Thompson covers in the book, The Barn, is he covers Carolyn Bryant and Roy Bryant, and talks about how at the time that this happened, Carolyn Bryant was really upset with Roy Bryant because he would leave her at home for extended periods with children, and she believed that he was being unfaithful to her. And she really embellished what Emmett allegedly said to her, to the point of, we're going to defend this, my white wife's honor, and we're going to go out here and basically kill this 14-year-old. So in any event, this book, because at first I wasn't really thinking, I just really don't need to read any more about what happens to Emmett Till. But this book, The Barn, is about so much more than that, because it talks about the history of this particular area, basically how it came to be inhabited, by whom, the attitudes, the beliefs, the hatred, the racism, the lynchings, all of that. And one of the things and he also talks about what's going on in present day. And so what has happened is the barn has remained, despite all of the different changes in that area, the barn has remained intact. And so the writer producer, showrunner, the brilliant Shonda Rhimes, who received, I'm not really sure what award she received from Your King for Bridgerton. She bought the barn, and she bought it out of a concern because, she wanted to ensure that the history of this particular barn was preserved, and the story, Emmett's story, would not be rewritten because it makes other people uncomfortable.
So Rob Bryant and J.W. Millan, right, acquitted. Did you know that there used to be a double jeopardy law in the United States? I don't think it exists in quite the same way.
You mean double jeopardy, meaning you can't be tried twice for the same? Yeah, it is. It's in the Constitution.
A year later, in 1956, they admitted that they, in fact, had done this.
Right. No, they openly admitted it to everybody. But because of the climate at the time, they were assured that nothing would happen to them. They could admit the fact that they lynched Emmett Till. And in fact, there were articles that were written, some by publications that are no longer in existence. Look Magazine, I think they did a story about them. And I mean, they admitted it. It was a source of pride for them. But there were a number of interviews, conversations with the family that was in an extended family that was in Chicago. And someone said, well, but the justice system did not hold Roy Bryant and the other people, his other perpetrators with him. They didn't hold him accountable. But Mamie Till's perspective, and I totally understand her perspective, is, well, yeah, they did. Yes, they did. I'm going to turn my light on here.
You're good.
They did hold them accountable, because at the end of his life, Roy Bryant was in horrid health. He died an extremely painful death. Carolyn Bryant had divorced him, and they were ill and in very poor health. And so maybe that was justice.
Well,
and she's,
karma's a bitch, as they say.
Yeah.
But okay, look, we need to wind this show up. But before we go, what I'd really like to know from you is, because I feel quite ill from the whole thing. And I don't think I'd have done very well in that time period. I mean, I'm Jewish anyway, and Jews have never been that popular. But I don't think I can cope with that level of injustice. It just...
Well, but you know what, though? Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. You've heard of them before.
Right.
They were the college students who went to Mississippi to register Black people to vote. And there's a lot of conversation right now, and that's what makes, for some people, talking about the barn and talking about the history, the horrific history of the civil rights movement, talks the horrific history of slavery in this country. And there's this conversation about not wanting certain people, those whose families historically perpetrated these ills, this horror upon other people, about not wanting them to be uncomfortable by the conversation, made uncomfortable by what their families have done and how they have benefited from it. But the thing is, there are two things that I have to say in response and in summary to this. Number one, You may feel uncomfortable about it, but it is in my DNA.
No,
I might not have
I
even, it
feel
was
angry. I feel
the
angry about it.
I'm
That
not angry. I'm not
I
angry
am.
about it.
I am, because if we can refer this to now, when
Mhm.
only weeks ago we were talking about the fact that text messages were turning up on black girls' phones
Mhm.
suggesting they should be ready to be picked up, taken to the cotton fields. Is
Well,
that
but but you know
have
what
we
though,
got
Garrett?
nothing?
See, the thing is that I just don't have the bandwidth to be angry, because if I was angry about all of this, I wouldn't get anything else done. That
No.
doesn't mean that um I'm upset, I want to do something to a white person or something like that. No. I think that in terms, there are a couple of things. We will continue to repeat the same thing over and over and over again until we can openly discuss and openly pull it up by the root, expose the roots of hatred, the roots of racism, the roots of lynching and slavery and all of that. Pull that stuff up by the root and expose it to the sunlight and the air. And another way of saying this is, we will never heal what you refuse to acknowledge. So this will continue to be perpetrated. It will continue to go on and on, generation from generation from generation. And so you may try to rewrite history, but it'll try to rewrite it. It does not change it. It doesn't change the fact that I know that the harm, the trauma, the murder from the door of no return in West Africa all the way over to America and what have you. My ancestors worked in some slave field. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And so what happened to them and was never ever resolved or acknowledged is deep, deep embedded in my DNA. It keeps getting passed down from generation to generation.
As we've talked about before, through epigenetics, that trauma is attached to your gene pairs, and whether you like
Mhm.
it or not, that is part of the legacy of
Exactly.
any black lady who currently alive,
Mhm. And
especially
so, but the thing is that, so okay, try to rewrite it now, but it doesn't change it. And at some point,
no, but
some
we should use this
generation from now,
as a signpost, and we should use
right,
it as a learning point.
right.
It's like
And people have to be willing to do that work,
ah,
because truth and healing is a hard thing to do. And being accountable, or not necessarily accepting responsibility, but even the acknowledgement of trauma is a hard thing to do. And I understand and I get that, but it doesn't change that fact. And the other thing is, I think that at times, this time of year when we're in the holiday season and I begin to see my family and all of that, sometimes I'm trying to get my light to come back on, but
you
sometimes,
good, good.
I see my family. And there are a couple of things that I think about. And one person who I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years, but especially now, and especially in reading this book, The Barn, I thought about my grandfather and one of his older brothers, who I told you the Klan took him.
Yes,
Now, my grandfather was born in 1913. You're the youngest of 16 children on a farm in rural Alabama. And the Klan took him, his brother, and they never saw him again. And I think about, as a mother, my own trauma, his mother's trauma, over having to swallow that. Because when Emmett Till died, you had you know, Martin Luther King was just kind of coming into, but you had the NAACP and other kinds of things that helped those stories to come out. In the 1920s, when the Klan took his brother, my grandfather's brother, there wasn't anybody.
No, of course not.
And his mother has had to swallow that.
Fundamentally, at that stage, you were definitely not just an underclass. You were, using Indian culture as an example, you were the untouchables. And
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like
it's only now, even now, it's still a struggle. But now, black men, white men are considered, well, theoretically at least, morally equal. But there's still people out there that still would love it to go back to the way it was.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. But, you know, this is where we are. And it goes back to what I just said. We will not heal what we refuse to acknowledge, whether it is my own behavior or some type of something that I've done or something type of issue within myself that I need to deal with. I will not heal that wound until I acknowledge it. And it's okay. The world will not end if we acknowledge. Look at what happened in Germany. They worked really hard to be honest about the Holocaust. You know, I'm sure there are forces
it's enshrined in their laws.
Right.
Of course, denial carries, I think, a minimum 8 years imprisonment.
And there are people in Germany who want to deny that the Holocaust happened. There are people all over the world but that has never stopped Germany from doing what they felt was necessary to ensure that this never, ever happened again. So acknowledging slavery, acknowledging racism, acknowledging the thousands, not just hundreds, the thousands of Black men and Black women and Black children who were lynched, who were murdered. We won't even talk about the Middle Passage. Who have have the ocean for their gravesite. If we can acknowledge that and talk about it, the world's not going to come to an end.
And we must keep talking about it. It's important.
Right. And so the thing I just leave people with, this is an absolutely stellar book.
So
can you see it?
The Barn?
Yes, The Barn by Wright Thompson. Stellar book.
A very good book. And look, thank you guys for being with us. I know it was a very passionate one, this one. I think it's important that these issues are talked about. If they're not talked about, there's danger they'll be forgotten. If they're forgotten, it can happen again. It must never happen again. Until next time, I thank you for spending time with us. To those of you coming through this time, up to this time, thinking it's yet another one of those hard times of the year, I ask you to keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and think 2025 could be a better, if not a wonderful year. Look after your mental health. Bye-bye now.
And happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye now.